This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to the first Dean's Seminar of this academic year. I'm Chiriyan. I'm the Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. And Dr. Bala Chandra is also a fellow of the Institute, as many of you know him. And he's going to speak to us today about disciplinarity, multi and interdisciplinarity in area studies. This is an area in which he has specialized and co-edited a book published by Routledge on interdisciplinary learning and teaching in higher education in 2009, and has spoken at various universities in this country, the United States and India on the subject, and he also edits the journal Language Issues, which is published from Birmingham. From the point of view of the Commonwealth, Chandra is a member of the Civil Society Advisory Committee of the Commonwealth Foundation. So I will hand over to Chandra to talk to us about disciplinarity, multi and interdisciplinarity.
Thank you. I'm extremely thankful to you for staying. You are a little bit late, coming from Canterbury. So my apologies. But I want to keep the presentation simple and then invite discussion on that, and then use some websites and PowerPoint or just some internet material to take the discussion further. So initially when I thought about this topic for presentation, one of the things that was in my mind was to look at area studies. And you might ask me why area studies, for the obvious reason that I'm based in Institute of Commonwealth Studies, which is an area studies institute in the broad sense of the term. But apart from that, I also thought that area studies poses certain questions which most British universities, or at least the research active universities, are interested in. That is the REF, or the Research Excellence Framework. Now the question that was before me was, how do we ensure that area studies institutes are properly represented in an exercise of this sort? It then raises this question where, what is area studies? What is its history? What is discipline, a discipline? And what do these terms, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, or transdisciplinary, some of these terms that are very often used, mean in practice? And how these things are relevant to not only to research but also to learning and teaching. So I wanted to sort of go back to my own experience of running an interdisciplinary program, a joint degree program in postcolonial studies. So I thought it might be of some interest to people who might want to see how these disciplinary boundaries in relation to area studies or at this point in time. When I use this word at this point in time, it's again to see this whole issue in a historical framework. So So I'll start off with by looking at some, say, for example, some area studies programs, because we need to talk in relation to something very specific, although we'll be looking at some of the theoretical aspects. So in terms of looking at something specific, so let me take some examples, such as, I thought of taking examples from the UK, from the United States, and from India, some 3 areas with 3 distinct historical and intellectual traditions, and how these traditions inform and underpin the notion of area studies, and also the notion of disciplinarity and what happens to it. So area studies programs, for example, some area studies programs focus on, the obvious definition would be that it focuses on a particular area, particular region, particular defined boundary specific part of the world, or defined particular specific entity, which is defined politically, economically, socially, and in different ways, but largely geographically. So in other words, we talk about South Asian Studies, Center for South Asian Studies. Oxford has an area studies program which brings together different area studies components within it, such as American studies, South Asian studies, and so on. So in other words, the primary use of this particular term, area studies, is related to geography, is related to something, could be national, could be regional, but largely to something very specific, in specific defined boundary specific in some ways. So when we study an area in that particular framework, then we get into this question about, when we study this, is this a particular discipline? Because academia is used to the idea of disciplines, because it takes pride in the fact that it deals with a particular codification of knowledge, it deals with a particular taxonomy of knowledge, particular division of knowledge into categories which can be sharpened, which can be made more sophisticated, and which can be used and reused both across time and space. So in that sense, area studies program should be underpinned by some notion of taxonomy, some notion of categories, some notion of classification. So this is an intellectual tradition which in post-Renaissance period has become much more pronounced in relation to classification of knowledge, in relation to categorizing known objects, categorizing human beings, categorizing areas. And so we have a whole tradition which breaks down the Renaissance holistic approach to humanism in terms of a same person being a poet, but at the same time being a good artist, and at the same time being a good scientist. So this particular consensus that there could be a holistic, encompassing human mind that can transgress or transform some of these categories gives way to industrial efficiency. That what we need is not that sort of holistic thing which one part attracts down the other part. Maybe it can maybe it can fertilize, but also it is a burden. So what we need is specialization. What we need is conveyor belts. What we need is industrial efficiency. So we have knowledge parceled into chemistry, physics, the so-called classical, at least classical in the current climate, so to speak, more pure science areas or areas such as literature and so on. So this particular notion that you could parcel knowledge into particular blocks and then explore that becomes very important. And that particular process of defining disciplines from the Renaissance holistic approach to more efficient industrial approach gives rise to various disciplines that we know of as chemistry, physics, and so on. But at the same time, the idea that a particular discipline is sufficient to look at the whole, so to speak, to look at something complex within a particular region, means that there is an inherent notion that a single discipline may not be able to explain, may not be able to analyze the reality as such. So in other words, there is a conflict between a reality, a real life situation, a problem, a social position, an individual situation, which cannot be explained by a single category if that particular category has been too specific. So in other words, if you want to study a particular region, it is not enough if you can have just numbers or economic data, or it may not be just enough if you know only about the focus of the place. So you need something more than a single discipline. So that gives rise to the idea of what one might call a multidisciplinary approach. So in other words, recognizing the limitations of a particular discipline gives rise to the need for what one might call multidisciplinary approach. So in other words, okay, two of us should sit together and talk about this particular region. Let's exchange ideas, let's exchange opinions, let's exchange our perspectives, and therefore we'll be able to understand it better. So it could be a conversation between two disciplines, conversation between a limited number, more than two, for example. My parallel sometimes, and when I look at this particular phenomenon of discipline, multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity, is to go back to the idea of pidgin. A pidgin language, or pidgin as a form of language, develops where two people meet and each not able to understand the other, and therefore they have to evolve a particular way of communicating, way of making sense. And so they evolve this particular, they develop this particular idea of pidgin, which basically allows people to make sense of each other culturally, socially, intellectually. But then, as we know, languages evolve from pidgin to Creole. They go from being a contact language, which is basically pidgin, to something which is more integral, which can have a mother tongue speakers who have pidgin, who have this as the mother tongue, which then evolves into something which is more integral. So it is no more the contact language, but it is a language in which you can imagine, you can communicate. It becomes much more usable and therefore much more integrating in relation to human beings, in relation to processes, and therefore to going from pidgin to Creole, what we find is what one might call an interdisciplinary domain or an interdisciplinary situation. Now these terms very often are not that categorical. They are rather loosely used, because some people just use interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary as interchangeable. But I am making that particular distinction because there is a particular difference in the way disciplines integrate, in the way disciplines coexist in a situation where we need more than one discipline. So the next stage, in the linear sense of the term, would be interdisciplinary, which would mean that the disciplines have something more than contact, something more than being put together in the same box. That's something more integral, and that particular integration could be in terms of methodological overlaps. It could be in terms of evolving certain ways in which a dialogue can be posited, ways in which people can disagree or agree about certain things. So in other words, even agreeing to disagreeing is something more than just being together. So in that sense, an interdisciplinary approach would have something more than just being put together in the same place. Now when I'm saying, I probably make it look very mechanistic that people have been put together. Say for example, sociology and politics are put together and they don't interact. But the reason why, I'll come back to the reason why I'm a little bit cynical about this particular ways in which certain combinations are made. But for the time being, let's go with this idea of something which is interdisciplinary. So when we're talking about area studies, we need to look into this particular development from discipline to multidisciplinary to interdisciplinary approaches. Now, more recently, you might have heard something called adisciplinary or transdisciplinary. So again, this probably has spreading over this is a sort of linguist playground. No, it is not. The idea of transdisciplinary is something more recent in the sense that the idea that disciplines as a methodological tool have had their days. So what we need to understand, if we need to understand something, is to go beyond all these disciplines in some ways, and then imagine categories which are beyond the disciplines, and these would be transdisciplinary. And transdisciplinary research, which is recently there's been a book on that as well. So some of this research basically operates at two levels. Transdisciplinary is at an elevated cloud computing sort of thing, which has something about discipline, so we can say that it's transdisciplinary, but also in a more utilitarian way, transdisciplinary has been used to link what one might call the stakeholders to the knowledge developers or knowledge generators. So in other words, linking knowledge generation to problem solving directly. So in other words, you create because this problem has to be sorted out, and therefore you don't need a discipline. What you need is problem solving. What you need is anything else as long as you can make this thing work. So transdisciplinary then at a level goes beyond a discipline, but also at a level negates disciplinary approach. So broadly, if you take this particular thing, these terms which I have put in some way in a linear way. Now the question that very often is asked is this trajectory of development linear? In other words, is it that here is a Babel, and then there is Creole, then there is Pidgin, there is Creole, then there is a language which is imported or borrowed and then used? Is it that particular linear, or is it something which is circular? In other words, do we have these things come back in some form, or is it always going in the way, in a mechanistic way, the way I put it here in this particular progression? What we see is that it's not all that linear very often, because what emerges disciplines at some particular point can get dissolved, and then or it can become a part of another new discipline that is being formed. Say, for example, if you take biology and let's say physics. Now you have biology and physics as two separate disciplines, but then you also have a new discipline that's coming up, some departments of biochemistry, hyphenated disciplines, hyphenated titles for departments, hyphenated centers of excellence with these particular hyphenated titles. So what we find here is that although people can feel very sorry about, say, a physics department being closed in a particular university, and what we see is that the next year the physics department takes a new avatar in terms of coming up with another physics linked to medicine or physics linked to another area. So what's happening here? What's the progress here? The process here? It looks like it is a sort of a circular progress. Which then takes us to the whole idea of looking at how disciplines are formed and how disciplines are actually come up, how disciplines are maintained. And why do we have this notion that disciplines are somehow more rigorous than interdisciplinary ones? Why you say that economics explains third world more than anything else, which is interdisciplinary in terms of development and so on. So this notion somehow that the discipline is rigorous, discipline is more illuminating compared to what a president of the American funding agencies calls area studies as mushy. It's almost you're having a mush, not peas, but not potatoes, but you have a mix of things, something like a khichdi, something like a salad rather than very tasty certain items. So the notion, one of the things I want you to look at here is in defense of area studies in some ways, but also I'll come back to it later, is all disciplines more rigorous than interdisciplinary pursuits of knowledge, or they're more helpful in research, in understanding reality, and so on. Now, when you take the idea of a discipline, what makes a discipline? How this particular category is addressed, is underpinned, supported, kept in place by whom? By what institutions? Now, first of all, if you have a discipline, you have institutional, you have, first of all, a conceptual category which could then say that if you approach the physics of a particular process, that would be helpful. So maybe that's the conceptual side. But at a practical level, what makes a discipline? It is being adopted as part of curriculum, as part of programs, as part of examinations, as part of having an external, the whole paraphernalia of learning, so to speak. So you have a professional group, you have a professional journal in that particular subject or in a particular area, you have a hierarchy of professional journals within that, you have libraries that codify knowledge along those lines, you have DV classification to any other classification, you can say, Ramadan classification, and so on. In all these categories, again, what we're doing is that we make those little blocks, and libraries do keep that particular knowledge as presented in that particular categorized form. So we need a whole range of institutions. We need a whole range of rewards and punishments which go with the maintenance of the discipline. Rewards, yes, because if you have a particular discipline, there is a funding agency for that particular discipline or a group of disciplines. So therefore you have funding for research, for travel, for community of practice being formed and supported. You have annual conferences. So all these things help to make a discipline survive as a discipline. And then on top of it, when it comes to students, when it comes to it being imparted and reproduced, the knowledge being reproduced through university departments and courses, you have students being told that this is how you have to write, or this is how you will be getting better grades if you do this. So you have again a whole a network of do's and don'ts, rewards and punishments, which can create a particular system, which then becomes a discipline and which is then useful as an agreed, mutually recognized way of addressing, of comprehending reality and also addressing certain problems. Now, if you want area studies to be that, then area studies should have all these things. And does it have at the moment? Yes, we could say yes, it has. Because now, for example, you take the REF, Research Excellence Framework. You have one unit of assessment called area studies. So you already have a way of area studies being recognized as a legitimate pursuit of knowledge. So area studies has this particular thing. So it also has other things in relation to it being recognized as an important form of activity and how our area studies departments are coming into being. Now, if you take the ebbs and flows of area studies departments, area studies departments in terms of their number, at least the number, is very often linked to certain preferences, certain policies that individual countries adopt. Now, for example, if you take the United States, pre-1945, there were very few area studies departments. Post-1945, between 1945 and 1989, there were several universities which opened area studies programs funded by UK government agencies and Fulbright program and so on. So these were seen to be necessary because the USA felt that it was necessary to understand the world, because that's where the competition is between Soviet Union and the US. So therefore you have a huge range of centers coming up. But 1989, end of history, end of extremes. We don't need them anymore. Why do we need them? There's only one superpower, there's only one unipolar world, so we don't need them. So the funding goes down. Our funding is being questioned. Is it necessary to invest in this? So you have a decline in the actual number of departments going down, although there were local initiatives by the universities which kept some things going, but in a different way in different areas. So you find that these particular, the fortunes of area studies programs, so to speak, are again linked to how they are perceived by funding agencies and so on. So the point I'm going back to is that area studies as a legitimate means of analyzing international relations, analyzing relationships between different regions of the world was very much linked to particular funding that's being made available to these institutions. Even in the UK, for example, many of the area studies programs or languages that are being taught in a particular area studies programs get a special funding from FTA for special funding, which allows these particular institutions to not to rely so much on the market dynamics of student fees and so on, but being able to be in a position to continue research, etc. in a particular area. So there is a sort of an official recognition and official protection, which then keeps this particular area studies program together. But now, I want to just touch on a few things before we come back to this. Look at some of these things that we look at. If you look at the RDF description of the unit of submission, and the words interdisciplinary, the word multidisciplinary, etc., the very challenge of disciplinarity is more, we can go back to the words once we finish, more fully expressed in the unit of assessment for philosophy than for area studies. How the team will look at a submission which has its coverage not just in philosophy, but deals with the philosophy from another part of the philosophy from another region and so on. So the articulation of disciplinarity, multi and interdisciplinarity is much more to be found in philosophy than in area studies. Area studies, it just says if you don't find the proper expert for that, we'll go out and get somebody or we'll send it to another department and so on. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the area studies program in some ways, although it relies on multi or interdisciplinary approaches, is very often somehow is a correlation when it comes to discussion of methodology. So a discussion of interdisciplinarity takes place in areas, not so much, which I found in my research, not so much in area studies where it should logically be, but then much more in other disciplines where these debates are much more vigorously debated. So my feeling is that area studies suffer from sort of a trust deficit. And the trust deficit is that it is, as I already mentioned, that it's a mushy area, it's a kitschy, it's not something really original, it's not really this, and therefore we can't rely on it, and therefore its composition is again one of the reasons why this happens is that its composition is very ill-defined, so to speak. Which are the departments, which are the areas that go into an area studies program. One could say that there are different things, and then some area studies programs foreground something and particularly say this is the main way in which you can comprehend reality, and then there are also other smaller things which come along with that. Now, for example, let me give two examples where this particular overemphasis on a particular discipline and treating others as a poor relation in some ways counts for this idea that somehow this is not a response. So in other words, there is no consistency in the disciplines that go in unless we look at the methodology itself, and therefore they become less reliable. Say, for example, if you take Third World Development course of Open University, it's no longer there, but when it was there, and it was a program focused on Third World, defining a specific way, and it had 5 strands, so to speak, 5 strands of inquiry: political economy, environment, gender, then you have 2 other disciplines that come back to that. So essentially it tried to sort of, the course people who wrote the course material looked at issues from these particular different disciplines, and therefore were able to portray something unified. But still, when it comes to the examination, when it comes to what the students is going to look at, very often it was very much political economy was very much their thing. You had culture as one of the strands, but certainly culture was not that important to understand this. Say, for example, this was something which was personal at a certain level. Say, for example, the summer schools for development very often had documentaries which would, this is not just specific to university, but you can take it across several programs. But I'm saying this if people want to look at specific things. Looking at culture was one of the strands. In summer schools, you had an event for culture. Films were shown. But films were shown not in relation to how you can use film as a feature film, for example, such as Kid Race, Distant Thunder, for example, was one of the important ones. How you could use that film to understand development is something that has got to be integrated in terms of this methodology. And very often what we find is that these disciplines are brought together, and the film then remains it can also be seen as entertainment, it can also be seen as a feature film, a film with a story, a film with a nice filming by a famous artist. So what we see here is that the particular integration that you need is often lacking, in the sense that there is internally question of is evidence produced by political economy more important than evidence produced by film? Is film a subjective way of approaching things? So whereas one is hard, with the term hard social science and soft social science is again used very often. Hard social science is economics, geography, verifiable, quantifiable, methodologically we have a quantitative approach, whereas with the others there is a qualitative approach, and then can we make these 2 things coexist? And if they do, what do we need? So how do we use the mixed research methods in this way to make area studies something which is legible, which has the credibility? So my approach here is that this particular tension between quantitative approaches and qualitative approaches is something which has got to be resolved if area studies programs have to have a certain acceptability. So the space for innovation, the space for newness, the space which I consider as a challenge is how to integrate qualitative methods and quantitative methods, which are very often seen as in oppositional terms to going to synergize, to bring to light some of the complexities that area studies programs can handle. Then finally, there is this one particular idea that the idea of post-1989 changes in the United States and how they influencing area studies is again a question which we need to see. In the era, in terms of globalization, in terms of physical national boundaries becoming less relevant and being replaced by global non-state aspects and non-state players is again very important, because that's where the so-called transdisciplinary approaches are emerging. So in other words, should area be defined only in something which is national, which is it's got the boundaries, which has got a very localized face to it, or should we look for something universal, so to speak, global, so to speak, global brands, global issues, so to speak. So this goes back to the earlier problems that the disciplinarity issues had. So how do we combine the two things? How do we bring these two groups together? A universalist would say, to understand poverty in India, all you need is, you don't need to know about India, but all you need to know is how poverty works globally, as if India is not necessarily a part of that particular process. But on the other hand, you also find that the same example being reversed, that all you need to know is Indian folklore or disappearance of languages in India, but these need not be seen in broader linguistic terms. So in other words, there is a particular tension where the two groups, what one would call a famous book on the subject called academic tribes, where they tend to see themselves as being more important than the other group. So it is resolving this particular tension between what one might call universalists and localists that is important, because the localists have something to define the universal understanding, universal, not elevating one above the other, but in terms of the approach. Whereas the other one also should need to understand that any idea has a local face and a name, and only when we understand that, we'll be able to approach things more effectively. So to conclude, what I'm suggesting is that the challenges that area studies programs or area studies as a discipline, the challenges faced are twofold. One is methodological. In other words, how do we evolve a method that makes it distinctive, effective? And the second, how do we make it, how do we fight this trust deficit? And that particular challenge, those two are the set of challenges. Trust deficit means we need to work in terms of, more specifically in terms of the UK, we need to look in terms of the National Student Survey, for example. We need to look in terms of why National Student Survey, for example. If you take the report about National Student Survey done by the subject center in Southampton of Higher Education Academy, they looked at the program and then they looked at, these are the area studies programs, and then in particular they did a research on that, and then they find this, the students, as much as the researchers themselves, would find, how do we say that this area studies program is good? Because I had a very good political science lecturer, but I didn't have experience in another subject was not that good. So this idea of finding a balance between different inputs into an area studies program affects not only the staff, not only the researchers, but also the students. So if you want to win the battle or win the war as well, so we need to look at NSS, for example, but also we need to look at the REF or EF for the research. So only when we do that, we can overcome this trust deficit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bala. Before I take questions, I'll just remind you that we have some coffee in case you would like to refresh yourselves. And before I throw the floor open for questions, I can exercise my chair's privilege, I suppose, to just clarify something about the difference between interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. And I was just thinking of it in relation to our own environment here at the School of Advanced Study and also at the institution I started my education career in, at the School of Arabic and African Studies, where we appear to be perhaps much more multidisciplinary than interdisciplinary. And maybe Commonwealth studies perhaps goes further down the road of interdisciplinary than some of the other institutions. But to take the SOA as an example, you have all these area studies centers for South Asia or the Middle East or Southeast Asia or Africa, which essentially are forums that bring together people who are anchored more in their own departments, history, politics, economics, whatever, language studies. And and in that sense, they seem much more ephemeral. And I was wondering whether, by and large, that is the case, that is more commonly the case, that what we have is multidisciplinarity, is a far more common phenomenon than interdisciplinarity. I mean, if you could respond to that, then I'm sure other people will have.
I think I take the point to make that in terms of prevalence of examples, the number of examples, probably interdisciplinary in the sense in which I described would be less because of two reasons. One is individual or related to the researchers, the individual actors, and the second is institutional. In terms of the individual people, because individual researchers, because their own intellectual background is often, as a student, is very discipline-based. In other words, they come from politics of history, they have studied politics of history as an undergraduate, and then they come to this particular interdisciplinary program. And so therefore, it's in some ways it is quite natural that there will be more multidisciplinary because people have come from particular disciplines, they stay in the discipline and they interact as necessary. But whereas interdisciplinary would be a deliberate attempt to break those boundaries. And so therefore, to make that deliberate effort, it requires commitment and often, I'm not saying that not doing that is being less rigorous or less committed, but it requires a specific effort and a specific context, and that's where you find that people may not feel that it's necessary, and therefore even in places like, as you mentioned, there will be a dominance of multidisciplinary approaches and rather than inter. The second reason is institutional. Very often we find, not in those examples, very often we find institutes coming up, not for any other reason, but some company like PLG or somebody went to the university and told them how to restructure the university, or spending too much on this, make 6 faculties into 4 faculties. So we combine all these departments and then you find a new setup. where some departments which hitherto were acting independently and put together into a particular administrative structure. And then they come up, and the easiest thing to come up in that particular context would be a multidisciplinary one, where you bring them together rather than going to interdisciplinary. So institutions would find it cheaper and easier to promote multidisciplinarity than interdisciplinary. So those are the two reasons why I agree with you that in terms of sheer numbers, if you go down because of vacancy, you will find more multidisciplinary activity than interdisciplinary.
Questions, comments?
Well, I'm very interested in what you had to say. My own field is not area of studies, it's English language and literature. And I suppose, therefore, alive to the rhetoric of such terms as interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, and so on. Generally, the context will persuade somebody who looks at from a sort of rhetorical point of view of the sheer slipperiness of these terms and of their the uncertain grasp that their users may have on their actual means, and of the extent to which their users wish to convince grant awarding bodies and others in the terms in which the argument has been set for them by those who are ultimately going to be dealing out money. Now, that's just a sort of a background remark. I have little experience of interdisciplines or multidisciplinary approaches in countries other than this one. But I suspect that in this country, disciplinarity is supported not merely by all of the institutional factors that we refer to, which seem to me to be extraordinarily important actually, but out of a kind of rooted pragmatic suspicion of abstract language. In the United States, and indeed in France, that suspicion of abstract language is perhaps not quite so much of a feature. I don't know, but I suspect it's not so much of a feature of the defence of disciplinarity. I speak as one who, though aware of these limitations, is nevertheless committed to them, which is to say that it's often struck me as a sad lack of emphasis that the School of Advanced Study is not proud of its fundamental disciplinarity of approach. That is to say, that it has institutes committed to a range of subjects which are defined as disciplines. Because I don't know of any other institution in the world where a number of different disciplines can flourish side by side and can allow a kind of interdisciplinarity to occur which depends upon a rooted confidence in the contributing disciplines when boundaries are crossed. And it seems to me that where the suspicion of such terms, of the rhetorical weakness of which is obvious, transdisciplinarity, I think is the most obvious of the weak ones. But that suspicion can be confounded if it can be demonstrated that an interdisciplinary approach is one which is rooted in the mastery of more than one discipline as a point of departure. And there, I don't know of any other institute or institution of advanced study anywhere else in the world that has quite the sense of disciplinarity in 10 different fields that this one does. All of which brings me back to various studies. When you announced at the beginning that there was, for some people, an inherent mushiness in the term, it struck me as true. I think it is true. There was an attempt, after all, some years ago, it might be 7 or 8 years ago, to abolish this institute. You remember this people of mine? And I know something of the background argument, the forces that were raged against Commonwealth studies, as well as those that were rallied to defend it. And the charge of mushiness was one which was frequently applied by examiners. And I suspect that what looked mushy was the way in which a term such as area studies, which after all applied to other institutes as well, seemed to be about things in general and therefore nothing in particular. Where the defence of the institute was mounted was when the argument was made in terms of the particularities of what it did. And that's where I come back to my original point that many of the forces that come into play when one considers disciplinarity, particularly in this country, depend very much upon reference.
Okay, thank you. I think the priest made some really valid observations in terms of some of the issues faced by area studies and being specific about the rhetoric, the suspicion in relation to abstractness, the relative comfort with which anything which is concrete, hands-on, is actually valid. There are key approaches, I could say, just in my experience. I had some students who had come from France on an exchange program in my class, and then when an essay was set, for them to write, I found that there were two different approaches. English students would start straight go into the question, and then let's say, for example, a question on Chiriyan, and things fall apart, they go straight into the text and then start analyzing. And the students from France, they would start off by Sartre said this about this in Black Orpheus, and then and then come back after 2 pages to Control said in this novel, this one. So you find that at the end of the essay, but there was they both are coming to the same conclusions basically, but the emphasis with which they start and then and continue different. So maybe area studies therefore might need a differentiated approach based on local intellectual traditions. And so therefore, if you want to convince, let's say, somebody who feels more a positivist type of approach, then possibly that has to be foregrounded to say that this is going to be useful for this is going to change this, Commonwealth can't play a role for Britain in this. So therefore, the strategies should be matched with the intellectual traditions of the place. So that's something which I agree with you. And then just one more point. You mentioned about the point that about Commonwealth Institute and how this idea of machineness and so on. So the idea that something is seen as such can be dispelled only if there is an effort to demonstrate that excellence can be established simultaneously by combining more than one discipline, and that is a challenge. And institutes such as the schools such as the School of Advanced Study is an ideal place because it has the what one might call a critical mass of people involved in this sort of research, and so and it's an ideal location for making progress along those lines. Because in other places, in many places, they are geographically or separated in many ways, but here there is a critical mass which I feel, if they take up this challenge, can make a big difference.
Oh, it's really following on really. I just wonder how useful the term area studies is, actually. Because I think your presentation raises lots of rather interesting issues, and I'm not sure about the language analogy you use and the progression there, because it sounds as though, you know, you put it into one discipline and a mixing with another discipline, mix them all together, and somehow you get area studies, which is mushy and doesn't have a great deal of trust. But I think trust is there from the constituent parts of an institution.
I would say from the constituents themselves, that is to say the people in those communities.
Yeah.
They have to be the source of trust. Institutes look out to communities, centres within universities tend to look in. And if the constituents say this is area studies, then it's area studies. It's useful, it's what it is.
Anyway, I'm not quite sure that gets us down in Chiriyan, but I just wondered about the usefulness of the term at all, frankly.
Can I just comment here? Because, of course, originally, area studies was linked to a particular language. This is burnt into my heart because Caribbean studies, in a sense, missed out because it either had too many languages or the English-speaking Caribbean had a language which was regarded as a foreign language. And they were funded in that way, the geographical area studies, because they had links to languages. The Institute of Commonwealth Studies is a historical thing anyway. I mean, my association with it goes back rather long way. But I mean, it was an institute which took in a sense, a number of areas in the old British Empire, Commonwealth, whatever, and so on. The point actually about it, the disciplinary study is, with that I go back even further. Probably 46 years and a week ago, I went to Sussex, and the full flush of its interdisciplinarity and so on. That was partly undone, not by the mushiness between the subjects or the failure to cohere, but brute economics. As people began to say, no, we're funding you with your history, we're funding you with that, and that began to disintegrate over time. I partly went to Sussex because it allowed me to do history as well as keep on doing literature, for instance. And I was compelled to do some philosophy, for which I'm eternally grateful, given the number of people who discuss philosophical problems without knowing their elbow from another part of their anatomy and confusing themselves. Especially, I think, a number of people who have tried to engage with French literary theory without having the background that French secondary school students have with the baccalaureate in philosophy and so on. However, it was also a time when disciplines, in a sense, geography was in a period of phase where it was getting out to mere mapping and stuff like that and telling you about regions and going into human geography more and more, which, I mean, I have a number of geographer friends who specialize in the Caribbean, whose work it is difficult to separate from straightforward sociologists, for instance. History itself, at least in Britain, I mean, it actually occurred early in France with the Annales School, with total history, was beginning to break out of the political history thing and more economic history and get more involved with history from the bottom up. As I say, I tend to be a bit of an economic determinist, and I think increasingly one saw that even as recently as 1981. Aston in Birmingham, which had, I think, a wonderful school of Russian studies and stuff like that, became one of the universities which lost out to that underfunding. One of the things they got rid of that was, remember, this was at a time when it was the evil empire. And the cousins across the Atlantic, one would think, would want to know more about the evil empire, but this area of studies then goes because the university itself gets taught.
Might interject on that is that, of course, it's economics, but you alluded to 1989, the end of the Cold War and so on. And of course, a lot of this comes down to the political context within which multi and interdisciplinarity and area studies emerges and develops and ebbs and flows. So, and that was kind of an undertone throughout your presentation. But do you want to say something about the politics of disciplinarity? I mean, I think that would sort of address all the comments that were made here in some way.
I think in some ways there is a sort of, if you're using the term politics of disciplinarity, certainly the debates about disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity fit in with the notions of certain purity and impurity, or purity and hybridity. So in that sense, it sits within a particular framework where this idea about rigor, for example. The idea about rigor and being useful, the idea about it fits in within this intellectual perception of something which is real and which you can handle, and therefore it is seen, and therefore it is useful. So there are certain overlaps in relation to discipline as being, at least in social sciences, discipline as mapping against a certain notions of purity, hybridity, and therefore some being, this is building a certain hierarchy within that particular approach. But on the other hand, we again see that the notion of disciplinarity is very much rooted economically, in that sense that its evolution is very much to do with the the framework needed for industrialization, the framework needed for efficiency of specialization, the efficiency that would come with specialization, say for example in a car factory. We would produce more if you have a person who will do something repeatedly and therefore will be more rigorous and therefore will be more efficient. So in that sense, it has certain overlaps in social science, but also it has certain overlaps in relation to sciences which go directly into the production process. So therefore, there was a sort of an overlapping consensus between the two that disciplinarity equals rigidity equals sufficiency. Interdisciplinarity interferes with that, makes it mushy, and therefore it's not to be trusted in the same way as you would trust something which is tangible. So it's that particular overlap which needs to be sort of understood, but also de-linked if we want to make the approach acceptable as well as used by developing institutions. So the politics can be very reductionist. The politics can be very can be one of suspicion of something which is not quote unquote rigid, pure, and therefore tangible, therefore easy to comprehend. So it's mushiness presents clumsiness, mushiness presents a challenge if we're looking for neat practices, and that extends to the social relations to industrial processes.
Well, the remark used to be made about Sussex people that we could talk for 2 minutes about any subject in the world and for 5 minutes on our major subject. So So the charge of mushiness goes back a long way in a sense.
Okay, if are there any other comments or questions that anyone has?
I could just offer a reflection from another different discipline.
Yeah.
Area studies is completely new for me. I teach at a theatre school, so depending on the company and the day of the week, sometimes I call myself a researcher in theatre studies, sometimes in performance studies. And theatre studies has spent half of the last century cutting the apron strings from English and literary studies, and establishing itself as a discipline that has its own vocabularies and its own methodologies. But still, I think, is an outcome and cherry picked. And the performance studies is probably 30, 40 years old, and is radically interdisciplinary. Is premised on borrowing from other disciplines and colonizing other disciplines, and claiming that because we have sensitivities and vocabularies for talking about performance, which happens throughout the human context, that we have the right to speak on those. And we can borrow the terms and the methodologies that come from other fields, which has some validity, but it does lead to mushiness. Absolutely. And that's partly why I'm here, is just to hear, to get a handle on how people are talking about this. I want to borrow and steal from cognitive science and cognitive theory to write something at the moment. The amount of work to do to achieve the level of rigour that a colleague in that discipline would have is fearsome. There's nothing to offer there. It's a kind of constant challenge in those fields. Is how much to challenge people who appear mushy, how much also to celebrate the fact that we have these opportunities to bring so many things into the field of studying performance in its own context and to apply performance in its own context.
We should celebrate mushiness.
Well, mushiness does take form occasionally. Mushiness out of the mush occasionally comes
I thought
something else.
It was raised earlier about, how disciplines themselves are changing, within particular disciplines. I reviewed a book recently on migrants and financial exclusion in London. It was written by a geographer. It could have been written by a sociologist. It could have been written by an economist. So, the disciplines themselves are not static. The boundaries are changing.
In fact, it's often, the charge of mushiness is often flippant, because if the analysis is actually good and we're using all the disciplines and nothing mushy about it, to go back to Sussex, there was a way to try to get around this. And when I was at Goldsmiths, I actually had to rewrite an introduction to history course, because we had art history people in the department at the time, historians. They had a course called Concepts, Methods and Values, which actually did look at how different disciplines approach things. And that was an awfully good round. I never did it because I was in the School of English and American Studies, and I think they did that in School of Social Sciences or something. The other schools had their own sort of technical fixes for crossing the disciplines, but that actually is one of the important things, realizing how different disciplines operate. Even if you don't know very much about the discipline. And then, as I say, it comes down to analysis. Charge of mushiness, well, reality is mushy, and it is. The physicists tell us that's half right. The hardest science of all tells us that reality is mushy.
And after all, we are in a land where mushy peas are.
An execration, do we want to say?
Thank you very much, Bala, and for your paper, and I certainly learned much more about multi and interdisciplinarity than I knew at Upper Scrum.